One of the most intriguing matches in the Chess 960 event in St. Louis has been between Peter Svidler and Hikaru Nakamura. They've both had successes. The match is very evenly balanced, and I've really enjoyed watching the games. Lots of very unusual ideas, and both playing very enterprising chess. So let's catch up with their match on day 3. And this is the second rapid play game. So the first one was drawn. In this game, Peter Svidler has the white pieces. He starts with f4. So interesting that he's not thinking about how he's going to bring the bishops into the game yet. Often, that will be the first idea, how you develop the bishops. But no, not bothering with that yet. e6, but Nakamura does. And that's pretty solid. He might be playing d5, he might be playing f5, and prepares to bring the bishop into the game. Knight f3. So with Svidler, it's all about the knights at the moment. How are you going to bring them into the game? And g6. I'm not quite sure of the point of that. One could just play the knight to f7 straight away. Anyway, e4, breaking in the centre and perhaps preparing to bring this bishop out. Knight f7, so the knight comes from the corner. It looks very logical. Now queen e1. I have to say I was slightly surprised at that move, but basically it's to do with preparing queenside castling, and he doesn't want the queen to go to e2 because that would block the bishop. And Nakamura plays queen e7, which again looks like a slightly odd move, but not when you realise that actually he's preparing to castle queenside. So these expressions, kingside and queenside, they have little meaning in this kind of chess. Anyway, that's what the idea is. And both sides are now castle. So the rook flips over the king, and the rook flips over the king there. And somehow, for us chess players who have a stereotyped view of the game with the normal starting lineup, then it makes it much easier to understand what's going on once we have the kings sort of in their normal castled position. Still an unusual position. b3 from Svidler. Well, of course, that one had to come at some stage, opening up the bishop's diagonal. And Nakamura follows suit with b6, allowing the bishop some freedom. And here is where Peter Svidler plays what looks to me like a very rash move, which I'm sure he regretted afterwards. Well, considering that this queen sometimes has the possibility to come here, then king b1 looks like a very normal move. Or perhaps pawn to g3, just supporting the pawn on f4 and perhaps allowing the bishop to come to the long diagonal. Both those moves look normal, but also the point is you're maintaining flexibility. That pawn might advance to d4, it might stay where it is, or it might come to d3. But d4, which you kind of think, well, of course you want to put this pawn in the middle of the board, but actually after this move you can see that that's a little bit uncomfortable for white. You really don't want to allow this bishop to have lovely freedom on this diagonal. It's possible, yeah, this could be fatal very quickly actually. Knight d5 could be really nasty, attacking that pawn, and that's already very problematic with potentially a queen coming here and knight b4 and maybe bishop h6 and looks very odd. So what do we do about this pawn here? Well, bishop d3 looks very normal, looks very natural, but let's see. After we take, well, we don't want to recapture with the bishop and give up the two bishops, so what about knight takes? But then knight d5, this idea again, attacking this pawn, and queen a3, and immediately knight b4 lands white in terrible trouble. So if white can't play the natural move, bishop d3, what do you do? Well, Svidler had to retreat with the knight, and this already looks really ugly, all to defend this point here. But the knight on d2, you can see, gets in the way of the rook and the queen and just doesn't look very nice. Nakamura played bishop h6, an excellent move, a non-stereotype move. The bishop is well placed on this diagonal, looking at the pawn but also looking through the pawn at the king and knight. So Svidler protected the pawn, but now g5, another excellent move from Nakamura, taking the initiative. Svidler took on f5, and now pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn on e6, and here I was kind of anticipating pawn takes pawn, keeping the queens on the board, and I think black has a pretty nice initiative there, because sometimes, you know, that king is a little bit insecure, but Nakamura made a very interesting decision. He played queen takes, allowing an endgame. But in fact, he's realised that he still has a very powerful initiative. There's a funny tactic here. Pawn takes pawn from Svidler, so that if rook takes rook, then you can regain the rook with a check, and then rook takes g1. So Nakamura just took on f4. But it's quite clear in this position that black has a very pleasant initiative. Just compare black's bishops here, beautiful diagonals, with white's bishops, I should say. The one on f1 has some possibilities, some potential, but the one on a1 is dreadfully placed, blocked behind the pawn on d4. So this pin is annoying, and the pawn on h2 is also under fire. White gave a check. And this is a very interesting moment. You'd sort of think, well, this looks normal. You don't want to play bishop b7, because then there'll be an exchange of that nice bishop. Nakamura played king d7. Again, very unstereotyped. You know, he's never afraid to kind of go his own way and play unorthodox moves. Even in normal chess, he's unafraid to do that. And it turns out that the king actually plays a really important role in the centre of the board. Rook g1 from Svidler. So he's looking to perhaps cause some trouble on the f file, where all these minor pieces are lined up. But now we can see that the king steps to e7 and performs a really important function protecting those knights. Svidler doesn't bother trying to protect that pawn. He's anxious to try and free himself from, for example, from these pins, and you know, he's right to kind of try to speed up his development and exchange pieces. And obviously, if knight takes, then we've got rook takes bishop. But knight d5 is an excellent move, and that knight looks at these very important squares, and that is really threatening, really menacing. Bishop c4, so that bishop was doing nothing on a6, comes back into play, and got to watch out for this, but still. Nakamura doesn't play bishop takes pawn. Then after this, then white would start to find his feet again. Suddenly he's much better coordinated. But instead of that, he realizes instinctively that this pin is still very annoying, and that bishop can also support the knight potentially coming into e3 as well. Rook d1, rook de1 played, and now rook g2. Excellent, putting pressure on the knight on d2 and also looking at the pawn on h2. Svidler played rook e2 to exchange that off, but now the knight leaps into e3, attacking the rook, and then bounces back to f5. This is very annoying, hitting the pawn on d4, and somehow c3 just looks too ugly for words now that bishop is completely blocked in. Well, in fact, I've just realized it actually drops a piece because of the pin. There we go. So yeah, knight f5 really is a horrible move for white, because that knight is on prise, and that's why he played bishop d3. So wins a pawn, knight d4. Svidler steps out of the pin. He's a pawn down, and this is a really tough position because all of black's pieces are well placed. So the knight comes in and hits the bishop. Rook comes up, and the knight exchanges itself off for the bishop. And here is a very interesting moment. You know, how are you going to make progress? You're a pawn up, you've got the two bishops. Nakamura makes, again, a very kind of unstereotyped decision. He exchanges off one of his bishops, but he's realised that this is a very strong move. The knight attacks the rook. The rook has to keep hold of the d-pawn, so it goes to h3, and now simply h6. And this rook is not well placed. If, let's say, king c2 to support the d-pawn, then the bishop comes here. The rook is running out of squares. Rook d5 threatens a discovered check. And then king f7, and the rook is going to be trapped. Very unpleasant position. So bishop e5 played by Svidler. I mean, he's lost here. Bishop g2 was the last move of the game. Svidler resigned. The rook only has one square, and then we can simply play rook takes pawn. Now that's two pawns for black. All black's pieces are so well placed, and if king here, then rook d5, and if bishop takes pawn, then knight e3. Everything is working in black's favour. So yeah, resignation was not premature at all. I really like the way that Hikaru Nakamura played that game, the way he fought for the initiative, and yeah, a star moment was this move after the check. King d7, excellent idea, and that really brought everything together for black. The king was beautifully placed on e7. Well, after that victory, in fact, Svidler hit back in the blitz games. He won the next blitz game, and so honours were pretty much even after day 3. So they now have 8 blitz games to play. If you want to check out my videos on the Topalov Kasparov match, then do check out the playlist up there, and the links you'll find, and also you'll find playlists of Topalov, Kasparov, Nakamura and Svidler if you want to have a look at more. Don't forget, it's free to subscribe. Click on the subscribe button, and if you want to support the channel, then do check out patreon.com/PowerPlayChess. You'll see the link up there as well. Thanks for watching.